Back in 1996, Nickelodeon wasn't just a channel, it was part of the daily routine. This was the era where kids weren't asking, "What should I stream?" They were asking, "What time does my show come on?" Because if you missed it, that was it. There was no pause button, no rewind, no app, no watch later. You either made it to the TV on time, or you had to wait and hope they played it again. And that's what made 90s Nickelodeon feel different. You had to plan around it. You'd come home from school, drop your backpack, maybe grab a snack, and immediately check the TV. Because Nickelodeon had a lineup that felt like it was built specifically for kids who wanted something funny, weird, colorful, and different from everything else on television. Rugrats was one of the biggest shows of that time. It took regular baby stuff and turned it into a full adventure. Tommy, Chucky, Phil, Lil, and Angelica made everything feel way bigger than it actually was. A backyard could feel like a jungle. A trip to the store could feel like a mission. And Angelica was basically the kid villain everybody knew in real life. Then you had Doug. Doug was slower, more awkward, and more personal. It was about school, crushes, friendships, imagination, and trying to figure out who you were. Doug wasn't always the coolest kid, and that's what made him relatable. He overthought everything, dreamed big, and somehow made a regular school day feel like a whole movie. Then there was Clarissa Explains It All. Clarissa brought a different type of energy. She talked straight to the audience, broke everything down, and made growing up feel funny instead of scary. She had her own style, her own opinions, and she didn't feel like a perfect TV character. She felt like somebody who actually had something to say. And then you had Gullah Gullah Island. That show brought music, family, culture, learning, and warmth all in one place. It had a completely different feeling from the cartoons. It was bright, positive, and memorable, especially with the songs and the energy of the cast. It was one of those shows that stuck with people because it felt comforting. Now Nickelodeon wasn't only about its original shows either. You also had shows like Tiny Toon Adventures and Alvin and the Chipmunks in the mix, which gave the channel even more variety. One minute you were watching babies go on an imaginary adventure, then next you were watching cartoon chaos, music, comedy, school problems, or something completely random. And that's the thing. Nickelodeon in the 90s didn't feel like one show trying to carry everything. It felt like a whole world. You had Eureka's Castle for the younger crowd, with puppets, imagination, and that storybook type of feel. You had cartoons that were loud and funny. You had live-action shows that made kids feel seen. You had educational shows that didn't feel boring. And you had programming that gave every part of the day its own vibe. Morning Nickelodeon felt different from after-school Nickelodeon. After-school Nickelodeon felt different from the weekend, and the weekend felt like an event. That's why people remember it so strongly. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was the fact that everybody was watching at the same time. If something funny happened on Rugrats, kids were talking about it the next day. If you missed an episode, you really felt like you missed something. You couldn't just pull it up on your phone at lunch. You had to depend on reruns, memory, or your friends explaining it badly. And honestly, that made the shows feel more valuable. Today, there's more content than ever. Kids can watch almost anything, anytime, anywhere. But because everything is always available, it doesn't always feel special. Back then, the schedule mattered. The anticipation mattered. Running to the TV before your show started mattered. And Nickelodeon understood how to make kids feel like the channel belonged to them. Was 90s Nickelodeon the greatest kids network era of all time? That depends on who you ask. Some people will say Cartoon Network had the better animation run. Some will say Disney Channel owned live action later on. And younger generations might argue that streaming gives kids way more freedom. But if we're talking about impact, memories, originality, and that feeling of everybody watching together, 90s Nickelodeon is definitely one of the strongest eras ever, especially around 1996. Because that lineup didn't just entertain kids, it shaped routines, conversations, inside jokes, childhood memories, and the way a whole generation remembers TV. And maybe that's why people still talk about it today. Not just because the shows were good, but because watching them felt like being part of something. So when people say 90s Nickelodeon was different, they're not just talking about cartoons. They're talking about the feeling, the orange logo, the after-school rush, the theme songs, the characters, the shows you had to catch live, and the memories that somehow still feel fresh decades later. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this throwback, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Short